Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're all most welcome to a very special program tonight here at the Aspen Institute, courtesy of the Aspen Security Forum. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker, the co-founder and co-chair of the Aspen Strategy Group, Professor Joseph S. Nye Jr. Joe is also the University Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus and former Dean of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and he writes a monthly column for Project Syndicate that I commend to you. This evening, we are celebrating the publication of Joe's memoir. It's called A Life in the American Century, and what a life it was. I was lucky to get a galley last autumn and had the distinct pleasure of reading it. From a farm in rural New Jersey, surrounded by pigs and chickens, he went to the highest echelons of global power, and he can let you know what wildlife he found up there himself. The Pentagon, the State Department, the intelligence community. And the timing of his memoir is particularly notable because we are celebrating the 40th anniversary of the formal founding of the Aspen Strategy Group. Along with National Security Advisor Lieutenant General Ben Scowcroft and former Secretary of Defense Dr. William Perry, they led the charge in forming a resolutely nonpartisan forum to explore the preeminent national security and foreign policy challenges facing our nation. Meetings had been taking place since 1971, but it was formally inaugurated in 1984. According to Joe, quote, "Our most important product was persuading key policy people to listen and take each other's arguments seriously without the hubbub and 30-second sound bites of Washington." And he did say this pre-Twitter, so he was very prescient. And we also know that Joe going whitewater rafting with Dick Cheney made the world a safer place. Joe was an undergrad at Princeton, a Rhodes Scholar at Exeter College in Oxford, and has a PhD from Harvard. But having read his book, I remain convinced that he may have learned more from his Irish granny than all of those august institutions. He's the godfather of soft power, as you all know, and he claims to be neither a hawk nor a dove. He's an owl. And so to extract that wisdom, I'm going to turn you to Mr. Bob Zoellick, who's also an Aspen Strategy Group member. He's the former president of the World Bank. He's the Deputy Secretary of State and a former USTR. After the initial conversation, we'll go out to the audience for questions. Please make sure your questions are, in fact, questions. After that, the book will be for sale. Joe will be signing his book back there. All proceeds from the book go to our Rising Leaders program in the spirit of mentorship with which Joe has dedicated so much of his life and time. We wanted to make sure that it continued with our group and our pillar of our work revolving around the next generation. And now I'll turn it over to Bob and Joe. Thank you very much.
So this is the book. It's a good read. It's not too long, so make sure you buy it, okay? When I work with professors, I always have to emphasize the marketing part of this. So the table's in the back, and he'll be there to sign it. And, of course, the signature will only go up with value with years. So let's get started. All of you know that Joe has been many things. But first and foremost, and always, he's a teacher. So I have some questions that are going to try to draw out a little bit of a learning exercise here. But the first one for all authors has got to be the one that gives them the platform. So, Joe, why did you write the book?
Well, thanks, Bob. And thank you, Neve, for putting this together. And thank you all for coming. It seemed to me that I had a collection of thoughts about where America is today, but that also about where it had come from in terms of its international position, and that by interweaving the story of my living through these 80 years with how American power has changed and the ups and downs of American society, it might be, as I say in the book, of use to historians and a benefit to my grandchildren. So if the ultimate readership is only 17, which is my wife, me, and my grandchildren, it will have been worth it. But I do think it may be of some interest to other people to catch what's happened since Henry Luce coined the term the American century in 1941, which he did basically to counter isolationism. And I feel like I've been touching this elephant from behind a blindfold. Sometimes a tail is a rope and a leg is a tree trunk and a trunk is a garden hose and so forth. And so I can't claim to have captured it all, but I thought it'd be interesting to other people to know how it felt over the last 8 decades.
Okay, so let's probe on some specifics. And I'm a big believer, and I think Joe is as well, that you can learn an awful lot from predecessors and what they did. And sometimes I feel institutionally the U.S. government and the policy community isn't very good on this. So let's pick a name that you and I know, but probably most people in this audience may not. So you started to work with Bob Bowie at the Harvard Center for International Affairs. And for those of you that don't know, Bob was influential in the Eisenhower administration, director of policy planning, later came back, I think, in the Carter administration, but was the Eisenhower administration had actually a pretty impressive foreign policy machinery. So you met him at a point where you were probably on intake. So what did you learn from that experience, and how might it be applied today?
Well, Bob Bowie was a wonderful, crusty old lawyer of the old school. And I became his research assistant when I was a graduate student at Harvard. And he could absolutely terrorize people. I mean, it just is the formality, sending back, time after time for corrections of the draft speech or whatever you're doing for him. But what I learned from Bob Bowie was an enormous sense of integrity. He had served in the Republican administration when I was working for him. It was the early Kennedy period. And Bob, politics just didn't sway him. He was basically focused on the larger questions of foreign policy. So I, in the long run, after having been terrified of him at the early stages of being his research assistant, we became very good friends. But that's what happens with old age. But in any case, I developed enormous respect for Bob and also for the way he described the processes of the Eisenhower administration, which was to make sure that all voices were heard. And later, Bob served as deputy director of CIA in the Carter administration, and I was doing the non-proliferation job there from the State Department. And we used to say that while we admired Carter and what he was doing, that we didn't feel that he had this sense of a solid strategy. I mean, it was too much reactive to different things. And that's when I would often hear about some of the details of the Eisenhower process.
So for those of you interested in policymaking, it's actually interesting to go back and look at the records of the NSC meetings from the Eisenhower era. They're very disciplined. They're very analytical. The president subjects themselves to different views and sort of acknowledges the difference. Very different than the ad hoc process we've seen in other circumstances.
Right.
So let's, you've had a long interest and experience with nuclear proliferation. So that's where when you came into the Carter administration, that was your sort of principal mandate. As I recall, at the start of the 60s, President Kennedy predicted there would be 25 nuclear powers by the 1970s. We're still short of that. So give me your little sense about what worked well with the nuclear proliferation. What's your outlook today going forward?
Well, it's interesting. When I came into the Carter administration and was made the chair of the NSC Committee on Nonproliferation, which had not just the State Department role, but tried to coordinate the government on it. So I had two hats on, which helped a lot in terms of making policy. At that stage, you just had the Arab oil crisis, the OPEC embargo against the U.S., and the view was that this was going to have to be solved by turning rapidly to nuclear. And then the question is, was there enough uranium for the 600 nuclear reactors we were going to have? And the answer was no, so therefore we would have to use plutonium, which is a byproduct of nuclear fission, but has the disadvantage of being easily usable for nuclear weapons. And so people talked about the ongoing or oncoming plutonium economy, and that this made Kennedy's prediction all the more likely. And I had been part of a study that the Ford Foundation had done with the MITRE Corporation called the Ford-MITRE Report, that had a number of people who eventually joined the administration, like Harold Brown, the Defense Secretary, and Spurgeon Keeney, head of ACTA, and so forth. And we came to the conclusion that we wanted nuclear energy, but we wanted a once-through fuel cycle, and we didn't want to get into a worldwide plutonium economy, which we didn't have any capacity to control. And so as we came into office, there was a pessimistic view that proliferation was out of control, nothing could be done. And what we tried to do in the Carter period was to get people to step back from the sort of the immediate fears of running out of oil and then running out of uranium, and to say, is it possible to plan for nuclear as part of the energy package, but not in the form of a plutonium economy? And the interesting question was, since several of our allies, such as France and Britain and Japan, were already producing plutonium, how did we organize that? In other words, how did you get a consensus around that? And Carter did some things to show that we weren't asking for special treatment for ourselves. He stopped the plant in Barnwell, South Carolina, that was reprocessing our own plutonium. But the idea of then persuading the others to follow suit was not easy. Some people in the administration wanted to say, just stop it, just don't give any permits for processing former American spent fuel. And I had the view that unless you could develop some sort of an international consensus among the key players, it wasn't going to work. So the battle was basically in that, what I would call the left, or the more radical, stop it all right away, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the people who say your whole policy is wrong because you should just be embracing the plutonium economy. And I was sort of bobbing around in the middle of that. But we created something we call the International Nuclear Fuel Cycle Evaluation Program, which basically bought us 2 years of an international study under the International Atomic Energy Agency to look about the assumptions that were behind this widespread view. And I think that contributed to the slowing down, as well as some pressure that we put on places like Brazil and Argentina to not go ahead with their processes. But it was a fascinating period, because from my point of view, the argument that you can just dictate, use American power to just dictate, you all now stop what you're doing, that wasn't going to work. Or the other, that you just say, let it flow, there's nothing you can do about it. Trying to steer a way through the middle of that was quite a challenge.
So let's bring this up to date with a question that's more on the area of nuclear deterrence. So China's expanding its nuclear capabilities. The U.S. deterrence strategy has been based on a notion of either the Soviet Union or Russia. How should we think about nuclear deterrence with 3 key players?
Well, sometimes people call that the 3-body problem. You can predict the interactions between 2 bodies, 2 stars, for example. You put a 3rd star in, and the forces of gravity become more complex. And there's a view that China had an approach to nuclear deterrence of what you call finite deterrence, which means all I need is enough to be able to destroy your key cities, and you're going to be deterred. During the Cold War, the Americans and the Soviets got into very refined calculations of if you have so many warheads and you have a first strike, what will be the residual on my side? And it came very esoteric. I sometimes thought of it as almost theological, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, but how many, how much deterrence can rest on MIRVed warheads. That basically, to my mind, misunderstood what was going on in deterrence, which was, we did a study, and it's described in the book, of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we interviewed Bob McNamara and Mac Bundy and Ted Sorensen and others who'd been involved. And we did it with Russians like Gromyko and Dobrynin, and we called it living oral history. And what became clear to me was the prospect of one nuclear weapon going off in Moscow or Washington or New York provided deterrence. And these very esoteric calculations we were doing about, second and third strike capabilities were, you got your deterrence a lot sooner than that. And so if when people today are looking at the Chinese situation, they say China seems to have dropped finite deterrence. They have about 400 warheads now, and the various estimates that they might go up to about 1,500 in sometime in the mid-30s. And then the argument is, well, if we're trying to calculate residual warheads after a first strike against both Russia and China, we can never get that quite right. I think it's the wrong way to think about it. I think the insights that we got from the Cuban Missile Crisis is that finite deterrence works, and these you can do a set of esoteric calculations showing that if the Chinese are increasing and the Russians are increasing, and we then increase to meet them, it goes on ad infinitum. I think it's the wrong way to think about the problem. And in the book, in the rehashing of the Cuban Missile Crisis, explains a bit why.
Okay, so one of the other interesting things about your career in particular, Joe, is, and you draw this out in the book, is that working with your colleague Bob Keohane first, you really start a new dimension of international relations, thinking about transnational relations. You reference power and interdependence, how it's still used a lot today. So let me probe a little bit on this interdependence idea. One new fashionable concept is we should weaponize interdependence. Now we can really use this to squeeze our foes. Another idea that I've been pondering, but you don't hear as much, is that might interdependence actually have some deterrence effect on China, not necessarily in an extreme situation, but in other types of situations. So give me a little feel about how we should think about your concept of interdependence today with a particular focus on China. Is it a mistake to be interdependent with China? Is it a constraint? Does it hurt us? How should I think about this?
Well, I think one of the things that Bob Keohane and I were trying to do when we wrote this book, Power and Interdependence, was to get people to realize it can be all of the above. I mean, there's a classical liberal theory of economic interdependence which says that as states become more interdependent, peace breaks out between them. That's much too simple because the major European states in 1914 were each other's greatest trading partners, and that didn't prevent war. And so the classical liberal view of interdependence, I thought, was naive. And then if you looked at the immediate precursors before Bob and I were writing it, of the Arab oil embargo in '74, where a great realist like Hans Morgenthau said he'd never seen such a transfer of wealth in the world without the use of force. And what Bob and I were interested in doing is say interdependence can be used as a weapon. We were getting increasingly dependent on oil imports. And when the Arab countries were unhappy with the position that we and the Netherlands took in the Yom Kippur War backing Israel, they basically created an embargo on oil shipments to everybody, but particularly to the Netherlands and to the United States. And what we showed is that means interdependence is a weapon. But it's also interesting to note that there are other players. So the oil companies, the transnational companies, made sure that the Americans and the Dutch didn't suffer more losses of oil than everybody else because they didn't want this to get out of control. And so to understand the outcome of that bargaining process in which the Arabs were using interdependence as a weapon against the U.S. and the Dutch, there was another player in there, the transnational oil companies. And the net effect of this was you had a huge transfer of wealth, but you didn't have a war, and the Americans didn't change their position on Israel. And so in that sense, we tried in our book to talk about different types of interdependence depending on sensitivity and vulnerability and the conditions under which they work. So it's not interdependence as a weapon or a source of peace. It's all of the above. As for China, I think the view that if we just have more trade with China, we'll have peace is a little bit like that 1914 example. But if you say, do Chinese leaders think about the impact of the interdependence between the U.S. and China on the way in which they behave, clearly they do. And so again, it's all of the above. Interdependence with China can help lower the probability of conflict. It won't lower it to zero. And so as we think about it, we should think of interdependence as in that complex way.
So you've also studied transformational leadership and people like Franklin Roosevelt, I think Ronald Reagan in his own way. So let me test you a little bit, bringing up to the present. Is it possible that a President Trump is a truly transformational leader? And let's take it. Let's take an assumption that he's elected again. And is it possible that maybe Europe has become too dependent on the United States? You got Eisenhower, back to the Eisenhower administration, wanted to try to reduce some of the European dependence. Is it possible that maybe he's actually more willing to avoid military conflicts than other past presidents have been? And after he gets through, in my view, disrupting the system, might it create an opportunity for another Teddy Roosevelt to move towards a more balance of power mediating system? So obviously Trump's a controversial topic, but is he transformational, and if so, how?
Well, Trump is clearly transformational, but transforming can go in two directions, better and worse. I think his transformational effect on U.S. foreign policy will be for worse. If he does indeed get out of NATO, as John Bolton suggested he wanted to, if he does cut off Ukraine by saying he'll solve this in one day, if he then continues with things like withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords, which are becoming more important, not less important, that will be transformational. The impact on American reputation in the world will be a great diminution. And in that sense, I think Trump is definitely transformational. Could there be a positive side to the transformation? You did see from Trump's first term some increase in European defense spending as a percent of GDP. But I'm not sure that it's going to transform Europe all to the good. I mean, there'll be some countries that may look more closely at their own narrow interests um, as opposed to really pulling Europe together. It's hard to know, but to me, it's too big a risk to take. I mean, I think the prospect of cutting off aid to Ukraine, which we seem to be somehow backing our ways into, is a disastrous decision, and it has an impact even before it occurs. If we don't know whether Trump will be elected or not elected, but a lot of people are beginning to hedge, in case he is elected, with net negative effects. I think it's true you may get some increase in European defense expenditure, but I don't think that's nearly as important as the way in which other parts of the world, Europe, but also other parts of Asia, are seeing a return of what you might call an American isolationism. If you look at the Trump supporters, and there's a 40% cadre of people who will support him no matter what, and a large part of these are quite isolationist. Why should we be bothered with the rest of the world? And you can say, oh, this is new. In fact, the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs has been doing polling since 1972, asking people, should America be involved with an assertive foreign policy, or should we just stick to matters at home? And what's interesting is the numbers vary between about 65% assertive to some cases 72, 73% assertive. But it means that there's a 1/3 of the American public which is traditionally isolationist and remains so. And this has been true despite the ups and downs of the Vietnam aftermath or the Iraq War or the end of the Cold War. And I think Trump has, as a political leader, has successfully tapped into this.
So you started your career on Africa, and you went back and worked on some African issues when you were at sort of DOD. Obviously, we've got now a very sort of tumultuous situation all across the Sahel, from Sudan on west. Any observations on security or the economic integration in Africa, which you started?
Well, I think Africa's a mixed story. I mean, there's a danger of saying it's all bad or it's all good. Some states have gotten much worse, and you mentioned the Sahel states. I mean, Mali, Niger, and so forth. Things have gotten worse. On the other hand, if you look at Ghana, Ivory Coast, Senegal, and Kenya, they're really better. And so I think it's a mistake to lump all Africa as a success story or a disaster set of categories. I think what we need to do is ask, where can we bolster those who are in the more successful side of the equation? And I'm pleased to see that Tony Blinken recently went to Africa on that sort of a tour. In other words, if the Africans feel neglected, then you're going to lose any influence that we can have. And I think it's important for American administrations, even if they don't see Africa as the cutting edge of great power competition, which our national security strategy says we should focus on, nonetheless, it's important not to neglect Africa.
I want to make sure I have time for other people to ask questions, so I'm going to let them ask about Japan, which I wanted to get to, because there's one other question that I really want to hear you on, which is you have had this almost a unique connection of sort of developing academic theory on international relations, but with policymaking. But you've also seen changes in the academy over your life. So, any thoughts about the interconnections of the university world with policy practice, applied history, institutional knowledge?
Well, in the 60s, when I arrived at Harvard as a graduate student, um, the idea of you know rushing to Washington, joining the Kennedy administration, was that was the path. And Dick Neustadt, who was a well-known political scientist, talked about the pattern of in and outers, people who would be both in government and in academia. It's become, and students will often come to me and say, "You were an in and outer. How do I follow your footsteps?" I tell them it's become somewhat harder because the academics have become more academic, and the the government side of it is often harder to really get into. But it's also it tends to be now more of a one-way street. If you want to succeed in this game, you have to nail down your academic credentials first with published books and peer-reviewed articles in academic journals and so forth. And if you are a young 25-year-old, you rush off to Washington and you have some interesting jobs, and you say, "Now I'll go back and I'll teach at Yale." They're not going to give you the job or opportunity. So in that sense, there's been a somewhat greater separation of academia and government than there was in the 60s or so. The other thing is, if it doesn't mean that academia is not subject to outside pressures. I mean, the recent grilling of the three women university presidents by the House Subcommittee on Education is an interesting example of that. In the 60s, outside pressure was radical students like the Students for Democratic Society and the Weathermen who were physically attacking us. I mean, a bomb went off in my building at Harvard. Building was ransacked 3 or 4 times, including sending one staff member to the hospital. That's different from what we have now, which is a coalition of billionaires and politically motivated people from pressing the universities. My view on this is billionaires should get their names on buildings, but they shouldn't micromanage the university. But what you saw with the actions in the aftermath of those congressional hearings was really efforts to micromanage the university by threats to withdraw funds. And I think that's an even greater threat, though a very different type of threat than the ones we lived through in the 60s. There's a current issue of Newsweek has an interview in which I described some of that.
So you were dean of a public policy school, so I want to press on this. The university world always has to evolve, and so Willin Bowden, who's done some good policy work and written a quite interesting history on Reagan's foreign policy, is starting a new school at the University of Florida. You see at SAIS, the Bloomberg helped try to create a special group trying to look at the question of history and policy. Your colleague Graham Allison works on applied sort of history. Neil Ferguson's trying to do that at Stanford. Is there an opportunity here to sort of create new sort of institutional structures for people that do have academic disciplines and credentials, but also the interest in policy?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes, and it's all to the good. The idea of the Kennedy School was very much in that direction. I mean, it was started in the late 1930s as a school of public administration where civil servants would come to spend a year and take whatever courses they want. And in the 60s, it was reconstructed to have a curriculum which was more focused, as you know, and which was to aim people for working in government. It still has a little, I mean, there's no one model. There's still a danger with that Kennedy School 60s model of being a little bit too much of the policy planners in the McNamara mold. And I think the idea of trying to find ways to integrate academia and government is still a worthy cause, and there's no one way of doing it. But I think I applaud the things that you just mentioned, but there's not one of them that's a silver bullet.
Okay, I might as well. I'll keep going with it to make it easier. So over to you. Yeah. So, and when I do, I would like if you just sort of mention your name real briefly, and let's try to keep it quick. So go ahead, Steve, and wait for the mic.
Thank you so much, Joe, and congratulations on the book and an incredible life. Just real quickly, I'm thinking here as you talk about the Cold War and you talk about nuclear policy, and you talk about an era that at least more than half of Americans have no memory of. When you sort of look at today, and when Bob said, hey, we've gone from discipline to ad hoc, which I totally agree with, at the same time you're dealing with people that don't remember the Cold War. They don't remember the Soviet Union. They don't remember the history of Israel and its relationship with its neighbors. So when you kind of look at that, are you worried that we need some kind of giant cataclysm to create a new North Star so that people take some of these issues more seriously in a more disciplined way than they are now? Because I don't see that happening with younger folks.
Well, there is a great danger of Americans being ahistorical. I mean, history started 2 months ago, maybe, if not 2 weeks. And so there is a danger in that, and I think that's one of the reasons that academics have to keep working on trying to counter that. But it's alas, we do work from cataclysm to cataclysm. In 1995, Jim Woolsey, who was then at CIA, and I had just stepped back from running the National Intelligence Council, and we got very exercised about terrorism with weapons of mass destruction. And so we convened a group at a very high level of classification and did some studies saying this is not fanciful, this is real. And we briefed it around the government and was politely received. And then we realized it wasn't having much impact. After all, you think of a government official, their inbox is like drinking from a fire hose. And along comes this report saying, oh, in addition to the 61 issues in your inbox, here's another one, and take it seriously. And you say, yeah, I'll put it in that box there to be looked at later. And so Woolsey and I wrote an editorial or an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times that said, this is a real danger, but we're probably not going to take it seriously until we've suffered some sort of a Pearl Harbor. And guess what? We did. I'd like to say that learning is more incremental, but it may be more discontinuous, alas.
So we have our headline, Steve Clemens urges calamity to frame U.S. policy. So I'm going to go some of the grandees here, but I would like somebody a little younger and maybe non-American also. So we start Paula.
Thank you for recognizing me as a little younger. Thank you. I'm Paula Dobriansky, Harvard University, but most importantly, former student of Joe Nye. You wrote the definitive book on soft power, and you coined the term. How are we doing? How is the United States doing on soft power at the present, and also as compared to China? That's been a big issue, and there are many graduate students who write about this topic. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Paula. Soft power is the ability to get what you want through attraction, rather than coercion and payment. It's not more important than hard power. I've never believed that it was. But to ignore it is to ignore a very important aspect or facet of power. And if you can combine soft power with your hard power, and what Jane Harman taught me to call smart power, you have extra leverage. You don't have to spend as much on carrots and sticks if you also have honey to go with it. So soft power is important. Now, people will say, but hasn't this all been disproven by the fact that you have current wars in Ukraine and Gaza? No, it just illustrates that soft power is a component of the power. I mean, look at Zelensky. He, as an actor, was extraordinarily skillful at immediately portraying Ukraine as a victim and getting sympathy for Ukraine. And that sympathy was then translatable into the hard power of weapons. And so if you say, did the war in Ukraine prove that soft power is irrelevant? It was irrelevant in terms of deterring Putin. It wasn't irrelevant in terms of Zelensky's being able to recruit support. And the same thing is, I think, is going on with Gaza now, which is that the Israelis will win what they need to with hard power, but it's costing them a lot in terms of soft power. I mean, Lloyd Austin's comment that the danger that they face is that they'll win the tactical battle and lose the strategic war. That's the difference between hard power and soft power. So I think it's still relevant. As for the U.S. and China, the latest Pew polls, which are good, reputable polls, which I know they had 27 countries or something that they surveyed and asked them questions of which countries do you find more attractive. The Americans were more attractive than the Chinese almost everywhere except Africa, where we were tied. And that reflects some of the Belt and Road Initiative and that the Chinese had. But if you look at Asia, China has a lot of problems with its neighbors, and it's hard to develop soft power in, let's say, New Delhi by establishing a Confucian Institute if you're killing Indian soldiers on the border. And so in that sense, the Americans still have an advantage in soft power. What worries me is that if we do get into a America first means everybody else second, and that's not a way to generate soft power.
So Jane Harman, you were invoked quickly.
So I've never been called a grandee before. I'm not
Grand
sure.
Duchess?
Yeah, I don't know what that means. But I think, Joe, you're much too young to write a memoir. And if this is your first memoir, fine.
That
but
explains that you don't understand grandee.
You have a lot more to contribute. My question is about Congress. Quick question. The only time it was mentioned was by you, Bob, about the hearing of the three university presidents. Congress used to be supportive of America's role in foreign policy on a bipartisan basis. Great members on both sides. Congress has now become a circus. Question to you is, what does it matter? And if it does matter, is there some way to get Congress to play a positive role for the future, and which at least I personally think is desperately needed?
Well, you're the expert and could answer that better than I. But what we have is a situation where take American public opinion polls. Majority of Americans, 70–80%, want support to Ukraine. Within the Republican Party, which controls the House of Representatives, the majority of Republicans would want support to Ukraine. But because they have such a narrow majority, a very small number of Republicans, the MAGA Republicans, can basically hold everything up to ransom. So we're going to lose the important instrument of aid to Ukraine over what is really an internal squabble between one of our two political parties. There's something wrong with that picture. And I think you could imagine procedures in Congress, but here's where you would be better than I, where you, instead of saying you have to pass legislation with the majority of the majority, you could allow more bipartisan votes. It's just one example. That would then, to free up this money for Ukraine. But there's something out of whack with the way we're doing it now.
Okay, sir, you quickly, and then I'm looking for a student. Is there any student here that would like to ask a question? Okay, you're going to be next then, sir.
Thank you, Robert. And Joe, thank you for being with us tonight. My name is Jake. I'm from the business space as investment. So obviously, as the godfather of soft power, and you have developed a very effective way or methodology to address the competitions or challenges among the states on this planet. And so to my understanding is this is just like a pharmaceutical company. During your storied career, you developed a certain set of medicines to address these challenges on this planet. And also, if we compare, question is there, what's your thoughts about applying this like soft power concept to the business world and to address the challenges, maybe competitions among the business? And to me, like the soft power is about a branding. So what's your thoughts about that?
Well, soft power is not just international relations. It's interpersonal relations, it's business, it's bureaucracies, and so forth. If you think about it, we all use soft power every day, particularly in democracies. We have police forces, we pay particular fees and things, but most of the time we try to persuade and attract. And in a democracy, soft power is a large part of day-to-day business. And for companies, look at brand management. Why do companies spend the efforts they do on brand management? Because it provides soft power. So I think the concept of soft power is not just in international relations, but it's a type of power.
Okay, you're up. You have to wait for the...
Hello, my name is Elena and I'm from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. And my question is very topical. It's basically about the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And I was wondering whether you believe that the US is losing the soft power appeal as it supports Israel and particularly within the Middle East. And what global implications does this soft power losing have on the arena?
Well, as I suggested in my earlier reply, I think Israel is losing a great deal of soft power, and that spills over into American soft power. I think Biden has faced a hard dilemma. I mean, the Israelis had every right to respond to an atrocious set of attacks in October, but the lack of proportion is a problem. This case before the International Court that South Africa has brought accusing them of genocide, I think is a misnomer. It's not genocide, because genocide requires intent to destroy a people or part of a people. But under just war theory and international laws of war, you're allowed to respond in ways that damage civilians, but not in a disproportional way. And 26,000 Palestinian women, and well, it's not all women and children, but let's suppose half of them are women and children, is disproportional in that sense. It does affect Israel's soft power, and that in turn affects our soft power. So our problem, or Biden's problem, is how do you maintain strong support for Israel without essentially endorsing Netanyahu's policy, which is driven by a coalition which has extreme right-wing settlers who never want a Palestinian state. And so Biden's dilemma is he tries to push Netanyahu into a ceasefire or humanitarian assistance or admitting that there is a possibility of a two-state solution in the long run. And Netanyahu turns around and tells the Israeli public he will protect us from American pressure for a two-state solution. It's a very tough position the administration is in. My own personal feeling is that we should support Israel, but we're probably going to have to be a little bit tougher on what we're charging Netanyahu for the support he's getting.
So the voice of authority is standing up. Do we have time for one
Indeed.
more?
If it's extremely brief.
Quick.
Thank you. My name is Timur, also a former student of Joe's. Joe, I'm curious what your thoughts are on China, Taiwan, the Silicon Shield, since I think too many people have read your book on interdependence, and what your recommendation would be now for Washington and Taipei.
Well, I think on Taiwan, there's a lot of talk in Washington that we're going to have a war in 2025, or Xi Jinping has said he's going to take it over by 2027. I think a lot of this is exaggerated. I think Xi Jinping realizes that the effort to take over Taiwan that fails is the one thing that can really challenge him on what he cares most about, his control of China and the Chinese party control. So I think the probabilities of an invasion are fairly low. And in addition to that, you have the interdependence. I mean, TSMC is crucial for the Chinese chip industry, not just for the Americans. So there is something in the Silicon Shield. But again, even with what I said, you have to be very careful to think that just having a high degree of interdependence or rationality can prevent you from war. I mean, it's really worth studying 1914. I mean, in the sense of the miscalculations that are possible, and the extent to which we provoke the Chinese in the sense of making it embarrassing or difficult for Xi Jinping to glide past 27 without having accomplished the goal of reuniting China with its so-called renegade province. The more we make that difficult for him in his domestic opinion, the more we get ourselves into a 1914 type situation. So my view on Taiwan is we should cut down on the rhetoric and the fancy high-level visits and provide shore-to-ship missiles that can be hidden in caves.
So, Joe, let me thank you very much and come back to Jane's point, which is there's a tone a little bit in the end of the book like this is a parting document, and we don't want that. So we want you to write the next one. We will have a community assembly to decide what the next topic is that you're supposed to write. But in the meantime, Joe's book will be in the back, and it's a good read, so Cataclysm. So thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Bob, for good questions, and thank you all for coming.
Great. Our reception is out the back. Joe will sign his memoir part 1 in the back hall there. Please enjoy a glass of wine. Thank you very much.